start with our first presentation, and I'm really happy to introduce my colleague, Duarte Viana, from the Estación Biológica de Doñana.
No? Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm going to talk about niches, but I will start with a short historical note. We all know that this is a zebra. I'm sure we all know this is a zebra. What perhaps is less known is that this was originally called hippotigris by the Greeks and the Romans. And it actually makes more sense because hippo is from horse, equid, and tigris from the stripe pattern that the zebra has. The original zebra is actually more similar to this subspecies of zebra, which is now extinct, the quagga. This is a photo from the London Zoo. Okay, yeah, better. This is a photo from the London Zoo. I think it's the last image that there is from this animal. And the original zebra is actually from the Iberian Peninsula. Apparently, it was the Portuguese, when traveling around the world, when they arrived to Africa, they baptized what is known as zebra now as zebra. And the zebra was actually more similar to this extinct equid, the European one S. It's debated whether it was a striped pattern or it was more kind of a, this kind of animal, like more similar to a donkey, as it is now. It is known from historical records is that it was quite widespread in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain and Portugal, in the 12th century. And then it progressively, its distribution progressively shrank up to the 16th century, when there was only 2 populations left. And these records come from the King Philip survey, which was presented yesterday by Paco. And there is a funny answer to the questionnaire by the emissaries of the King Philip II. And the respondent to the questionnaire says that he used to see a very fast horse-like animal, the zebra. Its animal had kind of a grayish rat-like fur. So it's not known whether there was a stripe pattern or not. The thing is that this was kind of a live account of the extinction of this animal in the Iberian Peninsula. And so this is the source, the historical source. It was a survey by King Philip II of Spain, first of Portugal, by the way. Yeah, Dark Ages in Portugal. And yeah, this is the geographical coverage of the data. It is now published as a data paper in ecology, and it's freely available at GBIF. It's about 630 sites, 7,000 records, and 2,024 species. If you want to have a look, you're more than welcome, of course. And this data is useful for many purposes. We all know that, so this is a window to biodiversity. We can have a picture of how biodiversity was back in the 16th century in Spain. We also set biodiversity and conservation baselines. We all know this. We have been talking about this during this week. And we can also learn about ecology. So we know not only where species occurred in the past, but also under what environmental conditions they were occurring in the past. So for example, I note here the number of major tree species like oaks and beech and major tree species occurring in Spain. And this is quite correlated with the number of mammal species around this area, and also with the presence of cork oak, for example. And by this time, there was bear here. So we know that the bear is now distributed in the north of Spain here, but in the 16th century, it was more widespread. And so its distribution went from the Betic mountain system up to Sierra Morena, up to Toledo hills, mountains, and up to the central system. So it was quite widespread. So we can see kind of some niche relationship in the sense that major tree species and these big mammals appear to be related to these more woody and mountainous areas in the Iberian Peninsula. And curiously, wine was quite widespread by this time. And actually people would complain that they hadn't any wine when they were asked by the King Philip emissary to the villages. But it becomes more interesting if we now start to analyze and quantify how biodiversity and the ecology has been changing through time. So if we start to add more historical sources, we can have a picture of how things were back in the 16th century using King Philip's survey. Then we have the Madoz dictionary, which was presented yesterday by Miguel and Paco. And this is around the era, the time of the Industrial Revolution, or the start of the Industrial Revolution, kind of arguably the onset of the strongest anthropogenic impacts, I would say, or perhaps not, but anyway, strong impacts. And then we have many sources for, for the present picture of the present biodiversity patterns. And so if we use this timeline and these sources of information, we can know about the distribution of many species. So this is the example of the European eel that Miguel also presented yesterday. And we know that in the 16th century, it was quite spread across the peninsula. Well, we can assume that. And that actually the distribution of the 16th century was more similar to the distribution in the 19th century. So there is this nice positive correlation. Then it is correlated to the actual distribution of the eel. And so we can also see with this that, that the consistency between these ecological sources of information is quite good. We can also assume that if distributions and environment change, the niche is also going to change. And so the niche is the set of environmental conditions where species occur or how species respond to the environment. And so if we think, so this is the BAM diagram. The niche is actually the realized niche is this area here where species tolerate a given set of abiotic conditions. So this is the fundamental niche of the species, but then the species is not present where it could potentially be present because there are other species and other biotic interactions that kind of prevent the species from colonize every possible place. And also these spatial limitations, species cannot arrive and cannot reach to every place they could otherwise inhabit. And so if we think about an environmental space given by two environmental variables, it could be more. and there's kind of a fundamental niche of the species. The realized niche is only a fraction of it, and this realized niche can change through time. For example, as an effect of environmental change or global change. And why is it interesting to study these realized niche changes? Because the fundamental niche is hard to study. We can do experiments, but usually, at least for vertebrates and all, it's difficult to be testing the limits, for example, the temperature limits of this species, right? And so we need to rely on observations to characterize the realized niche. And by doing this, we can also characterize in a better way the fundamental niche, right? If we're characterizing the niche through time, the probability of filling the fundamental niche is higher. So we're better characterizing or better approaching the fundamental niche of the species. And also because species distribution models are mostly based on the niche of the species, right? So it's this relationship between species distributions and environments that allow us to predict future distributions. But yeah, the thing is that usually we use snapshot times to do these predictions for the future. So this is a problem. So for studying niche change, we can use two approaches. One is model-based estimation. So we have our observations of the species. So here is an example with Italian crayfish here in the Iberian Peninsula. So in the 19th century, it was distributed mostly to the north of the peninsula, and then it slowly spread until the 60s. Then we can fit a species distribution model, wherever this is just a depiction of an illustration. It's not really a model, but anyway, we can fit whatever model to characterize the species-environment relationships, and then we can predict with the model. And then the niche change would be the difference in the spatial predictions. So this is kind of assessing niche change in geographical space, right? What is also interesting to evaluate with this model-based approach is the relevance of the environment, because we know that species occupy a given environment, but we usually don't know if species are responding to that environment. And so it's also interesting to know the extent to which species are matching the studied environment. So here is an example with climate matching. Climate is often used to predict future distributions, because species respond to climate usually in a strong way, right? We have our temperature preferences, and there are strong environmental climatic gradients in biodiversity distribution. And so climate can explain all of the distributions, so we would have a perfect match with climate, right? Or the model cannot be perfect, so climate is not explaining all of the distribution. And so the match to the climate starts to decrease, right? This can be measured, for example, with R-squared goodness of fit measures. So here, this is an R-square of 1, perfect match, and here the R-square is quite low. And what is interesting is that this can also vary through time. And so with John Chase, we observed that for birds in North America over the last 30 years, this climate matching is decreasing. And so there's a general trend for climate decoupling. So we have also to be aware of this. The relevance of the environment to explain species distributions can change over time. So this was kind of a little parenthesis to the niche thing, to the niche characterization. And then we have another approach, which is the ordination approach. And this is evaluated in environmental space. So if we have two environmental gradients, usually this is reduced or summarized with a PCA, with an ordination approach. And so in this way, we can reduce the environmental space to 2 axes, or the multi-dimensional space into only two axes. And then we can see where the species occur in that environmental space. So we can quantify niche in time 1, or niche of species 1, and the niche in time 2, or the niche of species, of another species. And we can measure the overlap, we can measure the exclusive fraction of each one. And so there are various possibilities. One is that the niche is not changing, so there's total overlap. For example, measured with this Schoner's the measure, which measures the niche overlap, also accounting for the density of occurrences in a given environment. There can be size variation in the niche. There can be shift without variation in the size, and there can be size variation and shift as well. So, and depending what the comparison is, if we're comparing through time, so niche change through time, so we can attribute this portion to unfilling. So this is the portion that becomes unfilled. And this is the expansion portion, right? Or if we're comparing between species, this is the exclusive fraction of species number 1, and this is the exclusive fraction of species number 2. So now I'm going to present kind of a case study, again with the crayfish, with the 3 species of crayfish in the Iberian Peninsula. This is work done by Miguel Clavero and also Virgilio Hermoso and Maria del Carmen Soriano and Fran. And so this is the story. So the Italian crayfish was introduced in the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century. There's a paper published by Miguel recently. This is kind of the king's aquatic desires. So it was by the desire of the king that they brought this Italian crayfish from Italy to Spain. And so first it was introduced in these royal tanks or ponds or whatever it's called. And then it started to expand by multiple reintroductions. And in the 19th century, with the Madoz dictionary, we know that it was widespread in the north of the peninsula. Then in the 60s, with another map of the distribution, I'm not going to talk much about the source now because I won't have time. But yeah, we can assume that this is the peak of its distribution because it was right before the introduction of the North American species. And these North American species of crayfish were introduced along with a pathogen, which is a lethal pathogen for the Italian crayfish. And so the species are the red swamp crayfish, or the Louisiana crayfish, and the signal crayfish. And so after the introduction of these species, the distribution of the Italian crayfish was really reduced. It shrank compared to the peak of its distribution. And so we can study also how the niche changed. So we first checked, this is just the first checking to see whether our environment was really predicting or if the environment was relevant to characterize the niche. And so the AUC, which is a measure, goodness of fit measure, is quite high. So predictions were good, the environment is relevant, so we can characterize the environment. And so to characterize the environmental space where we measured niche change, we apply the PCA to reduce all these environmental dimensions, precipitation, topography, geology, water, chemistry, well, a bunch of environmental variables into 2 PCA axes. And one is mostly telling us about continentality. So, and this is depicted here geographically. So we just mapped this variable, this PC2, and the map. And so it's a continentality gradient. And the other one is what we call abruptness. It's mostly given by the mountainous areas, or so it kind of picks what is the mountain ranges here, the central system, the Baetic mountains here, and the mountains up in the north, the Pyrenees, and the Cantabrian system. So it's an abruptness gradients. And then we can quantify each. Oh, sorry, this color is quite horrible here. Anyway, so in the first phase, we see that from the 19th century up to the 60s, there was geographical expansion, and so the niche also expanded. There's no shift, it's more kind of expanding. Sorry, so let me explain. So the purple colors are the first one, so the 19th century. The blue one is the 16th century, and this orange brownish color is the overlap between the niches. So we can see that there's mostly expansion, so this blue area. And after the introduction of the American species, we can see that there's not so much of a size variation, but there's a shift. And there's a shift towards less continental areas and towards more abrupt areas. So these crayfish are kind of going upriver to refugia upriver. So yeah, this is more kind of a shift than an expansion. And we can also compare the niches of the Italian crayfish in the 60s, so during the peak of its distribution, with a red swamp crayfish, one of the American invaders. And we can see that it's occupied a large proportion of the Italian crayfish niche. And it also expanded to other areas, less abrupt, warmer areas with less precipitation, because this species back in America is it lives in warmer ambience, so it's called the Louisiana crayfish. In Louisiana, it's harsher and warmer temperatures than in mountainous areas. And curiously, what is the other crayfish, so the signal crayfish, it has a different pattern. So it overlaps more with Italian crayfish, so the overlap is greater. And it's also curious that it's also kind of expanding in the same direction as the Italian crayfish through time. And so it's kind of occupying the Italian crayfish niche. So there's a complementarity between these two, the niches of the American species that are constraining or occupying the niche of the Italian crayfish. So lastly, we asked whether the extent to which the American species are occupying the whole historical niche of the Italian species. And we can see that a great proportion of the Italian niche is being occupied by the invaders, the American invaders. And they have expanded quite a bit, and the Italian crayfish is now living in these fewer habitats in mountains upriver. And so just to finish, we know that historical information is useful for understanding ecology and quantifying change. We have been talking about this during this week. More novel of this talk is that realized niches can be highly dynamic, depending on various pressures. In this case, it was biological invasions that were driving these niche changes, but it can be also other global changes. So in this case, the Italian crayfish was kind of pushed, let's say, upriver to abrupt and less continental areas, less exploited in the past. And ideally, we should combine model-based and ordination approach because they tell us different stories about the niche. So we can characterize the niche with the ordination approach, but it's useful to see also how species are responding to that environment. And yeah, I didn't talk about this, but we should also discuss how to account for uncertainties in different sources of data resolutions as much as possible. We had an approach in our paper that is now submitted, but yeah, there's various possibilities. But I won't talk about this, just to mention that we should think about this. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Duarte. So we have time for a couple of questions. Let's see, John and Molly.
That's really cool, Duarte, thanks. I know you're familiar with these joint species distribution models, and I was just wondering, the crayfish, at least where I'm familiar in the US, are really important for the whole food web. They're food, they're horrible detritivore predator things. Have you thought about exploring their dynamic interactions with the fish or any of the other things in these older surveys?
Well, we can do that with these surveys, perhaps. What we can do, so for example, we have now a different project in Doñana, and we are trying to see how the bird community, the aquatic bird community in Doñana, has been interacting with the crayfish, and perhaps the joint species distribution models would be a really nice approach, because then we can kind of have this biotic component and the abiotic niche component, and kind of try to see if how these different components change through time. Yeah, that would be really cool. We didn't do it yet, but we're kind of getting there, I would say.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I've been thinking a lot about changes in realized niche recently. And I was wondering if you're trying to characterize the realized niche in the past, if we don't have data that are as good as you have here for Spain for the recent past, is there a threshold or a minimum number of occurrences that you would need to try and think about what the realized niche used to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, our observations are never complete, so we have to understand that, and so we have to think that we'll never cover the complete space or range of the species, nor the complete temporal span that we should. And so, but yeah, I cannot give a precise answer to that. It's really difficult to know. Especially with historical data, right? Because these data are even scarcer than nowadays data. So, yeah, I don't know.
Thanks.
Thanks, Duarte. Really cool. What do you think? Obviously, the colonization processes of the American crayfish and the signal crayfish, they're still going on. So what, in the long term, what would you foresee? Would the Italian crayfish expected to be completely eliminated, the two species coexist?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are still reintroductions. I think people is still, Miguel can correct me if I'm wrong, people are still moving crayfish around. And so if the Italian crayfish, I'm not saying that we should conserve the Italian crayfish, but if the Italian crayfish has luck, it can be in places or be reintroduced in places where the other species are not present. And they, of course, can go upriver by their own means. They don't have to be reintroduced, but it's difficult for them to move across or between different basins. And so they have to rely on human transportation, I would say, to survive, right? But what we can say from our data is that the American species are occupying most of the Italians, at least the historical niche of the Italian crayfish. And so the prospects are not good for this species. Not sure if it's a good or bad thing in terms of conservation of biodiversity, but yeah, that's the pattern. Yeah.
But I mean, they're not occupying all of the niche yet, but is that just because of dispersal limitation? So that's my question, kind of, in the sense that, is there anything fundamentally different between the niche of the Italian crayfish and the signal crayfish?
I don't know, to be honest. So yeah, we know that the Italian crayfish is surviving in these fewer habitats, which is, by the way, it's not even significant if we compare to a random pattern. So it's really a small portion of the environments that the signal crayfish is not present. And I don't know if this will hold in the future, if the signal crayfish will reach these habitats or not. So I cannot answer that. I'm not sure if there are any preference, for example, in terms of fishing for the signal or do you know that, Miguel?
For the signal, because it is more similar to the Italian, so people really prefer the signal. But now it's
okay.
These ectoparasites, kind of parasite, these branchiopteran worms, and people have started. The people used to like the signal because it was like the Austropotamobius. It's white tail, more meat, and so on. But now they are full now of branchiopteran worms, which live in the body of the crayfish, which are also American. And now they are simply full of they didn't come at the beginning with the crayfish, but in some transplantation they didn't come. And now people have when they boil crayfish, it is full of worms, so people are starting to dislike the signal crayfish, but they are everywhere now. So, can I follow? Is that I wanted to follow Molly's comment about how much information we have in Spain, and it is interesting because in Spain we used to be depressed all the time about how few information we had. So compared with English or American and so on, we have never done anything. So it is, and this now we have a lot of information. It is we have just started scratching information. So we have a huge amount of information to uncover yet. So this is the very beginning, and it is really an impressive amount of records. And the important thing, I think, is that everywhere there are these lots of information. Everywhere, at least in Europe and Turkey, for sure in China, and several places that they have this kind of information for really long term and really abundant. So the information is there for someone to go and get it. So this kind of lots of data is a small amount compared with what there is and can be gotten everywhere.
Thanks, Ria. Is there any other question for Duarte? Okay, I have one from Jennifer there.
So just following up on those questions, so all three of these species are invasive, right? So presumably there's also distribution data elsewhere. Are there environmental requirements similar, or do they suggest that they should be able to occupy more of Iberia or the same places, or do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, so we have another person in the group which is working on that topic precisely. And so, for example, the situation in Italy is also quite critical as well, and I think there's the same pattern there, that the Italian crayfish is going upriver in Italy, and The red swamp crayfish is spreading a lot everywhere, but it's from more southern and warmer habitats. So that's the preference of in the native range as well. So in North America, and the signal crayfish is more from the same type of habitats as the Italian crayfish, and so I would guess that the signal is the one that is going to determine the fate of the Italian crayfish. But yeah, we have another person working on that, so we will have more answers in the near future. Perhaps Miguel also knows better than me because. But yeah, thanks for the question.
If it's really quick, but then I'll.
Okay, it was just to say that in France we have another American species which was called Orchodectes limosus, Faxonus limosus now it's called, and it's very widespread into Europe, and it was introduced during the 19th century, and it has the same niche as the Louisiana crawfish, and the Louisiana crawfish has make it disappearing. So there is, I should say, a competition, niche competition between introduced species.
Mm-hmm. It's this paper, rock, scissors game, right, where species are competing with each other and others exclude one species, and this species, the other species excludes the other one. So it's
almost like Italian between Pachyphastacus. So Pachyphastacus getting upper. But the thing is that I think that for Pachyphastacus, the human factor is much more important because of the habitat is more harder to colonize. In large rivers, for instance, and even Louisiana crawfish, it can go from drying, it works on the soil and colonize ponds, and not like Pachyphastacus. Pachyphastacus needs the man to introduce it into small rivers.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that goes back a little bit to...
I mean, for the dynamic of the niche realization, I think it's quite different. Mm-hmm. And the Louisiana invaded really rapidly in a few years. Pachyphastacus, for instance, it took 30 years, maybe more, to get into small streams.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be interesting to pull all this data into these joint species distribution models and see how this competition and biotic interactions are playing out to determine these dynamics in time, right? And man, of course. Yeah, thanks.
So thanks.